There's just something exciting about uncovering the lies of the secret puppet masters. It's like the end of an episode of Scooby-Doo when they pull the mask off the villain.
Now let's see who's really behind these bandages.
Dr. Najib!
In those episodes, the villain is usually just one guy. When we pull the mask off the villain, it's a whole slew of villains. It's like the entire world is in on the fix. Except for the world has no idea that they are all part of it. Then we come along snatching all types of masks, and now the public puppets feel exposed. How dare you snatch the mask off my massa like that? He's a good man. He taught me about my history. It's crazy how so many people know they've been lied to about world history. But when you tell them about some of those lies, all of a sudden, you're the crazy conspiracy theorist. I can show you proof that so-called black people have been in America for thousands of years. We could dig up the oldest burial sites on the continent full of so-called Negroes, and people would still say those black people all came from Africa on a slave ship. Now, we know because we've actually done the research that this is an utterly preposterous assertion, a gargantuan lie spoon-fed to the public through an ongoing psyop. But the public clings to that lie for precious oxygen, as if their life depended on it. It's like being in an abusive relationship. No matter how bad they beat your ass, you're not finna leave them.
Come on now, I'm asking you nice.
And I'm saying no nice.
Being alone is a scary proposition, and the streets of truth are a lonely place. For most people, history is a boring subject. Static in nature, whatever happened, happened. And we've already been told what happened, so to them, there's nothing more to gain from the subject. But what if those things they say that happened didn't happen the way they say it did? To the truth seeker, this is an intriguing possibility. Some people simply DGAF, and we're not talking about those people. These would be the same people who tell you you're wrong about something they've never investigated for themselves. You should spend about as much time debating these people as they spend in search of the truth. And you shouldn't be surprised if you have some spare time on your hands. It's like arguing with a monkey about who came from who. Your time is better spent elsewhere. Besides, if you believe you came from a monkey, but America is Egypt is incomprehensible, maybe this isn't the message for you. And really, this is the problem with the world historical narrative in general. It's boxed in by their asinine theories. It's ironic how so many people who assert a belief in God adopt the statutes of godless heathens. Hey, bro, I didn't come from no monkey, but all mankind came from Africa. Nigga, you are an oxyafro-moron, a coonigma, a contradiction. You can't have it both ways. You locked into every leg of that parlay, big dog. You can't cherry pick which part of the out of Africa theory you like the most, because if you remove even a single card, the entire house collapses upon itself. And if a house can't collapse so easily, surely you could consider an alternative to their history. And if you can consider an alternative to their history, why not, at least for a second, consider the Torah and Tanakh as an alternate history book? You could literally consider the book fiction and still learn more about world history than is taught in any school anywhere, because that very same world history that is taught in schools is based upon the very same work of fiction you consider the Old Testament to be. The only difference is they perverted the information in the Bible to fit their deceptive template. When I say Egypt, the first thing most people think of are the pyramids of Giza. But those pyramids don't have anything to do with the Old Testament, even though they are supposedly older than the Torah itself. There are no reliable accounts of the pyramids from the Old Testament or Torah, or even the New Testament for that matter. But through the perversion of the standardized education system, we have all been implanted with this pyramid scheme, pun intended, that has no biblical validity, although people think it does. The descriptions given of so-called Egypt from the Old Testament could have never happened in the location of modern Egypt. In this installment, I present even more evidence that not only is America Egypt, but also the ancient Holy Land, based on descriptions given in the Torah and Tanakh.
And you deal with it.
They can't stop us. No matter what they do, they can't stop us. Lex. They can't stop us. Lex. Nah. They can't stop us. Yeah. We ain't build no slave ship. We ain't make those anchors. We ain't plot those grave sites up since daylight. Burdened by the things we try to make right. It's gonna be a late night. So much turmoil makes my blood boil. Kundalini, encore. Earth to sun broad. Dirt is unsoiled. With one chord, tell a story that some spoil. Watch it unfold. Stories untold. Copyright unsold. Books with one spine. Ghosts with one soul. They want control. You want control. But we share one goal. We fight one foe. Satchel front door. And it keeps knocking, but the people kept rocking. Yeah. It keeps knocking, but the people kept rocking, yeah. Can't stop, flex, whatever they do. They can't stop, keeps knocking, but the people kept rocking, yeah. They can't stop us, no, nah, they can't stop us, no, they can't stop us.
Let's refocus our attention on the American Southwest. We have discussed many characteristics of this region in previous episodes and the past history of the tribes of this region, and even some of the archaeological sites of this region. But this area is so chock full of hidden history, it's impossible to cover everything. It should not be overlooked that this region was once home to a massive population of people and differently stratified and structured civilizations. These various people have been left abandoned by the history books as if they never existed. And yet these various megacities of the American Southwest have a far larger civilizational footprint than even the largest cities in Eurasia and Africa, where they routinely overestimate the populations of cities like Alexandria, Memphis, London, and Rome. They routinely underestimate the populations of cities like Cahokia, Big Mound, Chichen Itza, Cholula, and Tenochtitlan, just to name a few. All cities in America larger than even their largest cities don't seem to play a role in their special world history. But who could blame them? It's not like America even existed to them 2,000 years ago. Have you seen a map from a first century European? Have you seen a Strabo map? Have you seen the Eratosthenes map? Have you seen a Ptolemy map? These were the standards of old world cartography. Taking a serious look at this map, we could not take these maps seriously, and yet they are held as the standard, and this was the world according to them. On some of these old world maps of Egypt, you'll be hard pressed to find even one pyramid. When they've taken the time to illustrate animals, trees, churches, and farms, one of the 7 wonders of the world. Must be why they couldn't take 7 seconds to illustrate a pyramid accurately. But that's beside the point. The point is that our version of history is relatively a new thing. So the attention to chronological detail is essential in order to unfold the fuckery. If world history happened the way they said it did, then Egypt should have been well known long before 1800. But it wasn't. The most glaring omission from the history of ancient Egypt being the location of Egypt in the Bible is the absolute zero evidence of the Exodus or even Hebrew habitation, which would literally be impossible if this place was the place they say it is. How is there zero evidence for the Exodus? Now, a person could simply just say that the Exodus never existed and the whole story is made up. But then you would have the problem of everything associated with that biblical account being void, basically meaning that the subsequent histories and locations of all associated elements are now non-existent. Basically meaning you should be open to the idea of some sort of fabrication. This assertion alone is enough to literally destroy any evidence of anything biblically connected in the entire region. And I'm not just talking about Egypt. The area they proposed was the land of Goshen, the place where the Israelites began their journey, is literally less than 200 miles from Jerusalem present day, and less than 150 miles from the border of Israel. But there is no evidence for the Exodus or even a significant population of ancient Hebrews in either location. That would seem impossible considering their close proximity to each other. We can find puddin'-faced niggas in Indiana, but no Hebrews in Egypt? There's obviously some fuckery amiss. The Exodus was a monumental event. Most estimates state that the number of people participating in the Exodus was over 2 million, including over 600,000 fighting men, according to Exodus 12:37. So how is there no evidence for 2 million Hebrews from a place whose largest city was barely 50,000 people? Not only that, but there's no evidence of any Israelite habitation less than 150 miles from Israel? Somebody please make that make sense, because it doesn't. We know that through the narrative of trade connections in the ancient world, the Egyptians traded with the Mesopotamians thousands of miles away, but there's still no evidence of any relationship between two closer places in Israel and Egypt anywhere in the archaeological record. How, Sway?
Or do you want to marginalize me till I'm out of my moment?
Or why don't you empower yourself and don't need them and do it yourself?
How, Sway?
Take a few steps back to go.
You ain't got the answers, man. You ain't got the answers.
Welcome back to Charlatan's Web, sources and parallels of the Exodus. Let's consult the charlatans and their ideas of what happened with the Exodus. The Exodus is the founding myth of the Israelites. The scholarly consensus is that the Exodus, as described in the Torah, is not historical, even though there may be a historical core behind the biblical narrative. So even the idea of looking at the Torah as a history book can't really be taken seriously, is what they're saying. Modern archaeologists believe that the Israelites were indigenous to Canaan and were never in ancient Egypt, which is interesting in itself, considering where they say Canaan was. So the proximity of Canaan and ancient Egypt is less than 200 miles. That's like saying, if you live in DC, you've never been to New York. No one from DC has ever been to New York, apparently. No one from Atlanta has ever been to Charlotte. That's the literal proximity of these places that we're talking about. But modern archaeologists say that the Israelites have never been in Egypt. Continuing, and if there's any historical basis to the Exodus, it can apply only to a small segment of the population of Israelites at large. Nevertheless, it is also commonly argued that some historical event may have inspired these traditions. Even if Moses and the Exodus narrative belong to the collective cultural memory rather than history. Let me read that again. Even if Moses and the Exodus narrative belong to the collective cultural memory rather than history. You see how these stories become legends, and then sometimes people adopt other people's legends for their own, or they reappropriate it, or they rewrite it. According to Avraham Faust, most scholars agree that the narrative has a historical core and that some of the highland settlers came one way or another from Egypt. I don't really know what that means, okay? Avraham Faust. Sounds like one of those guys. Oh, he's an Israeli archaeologist. I've heard that nigga's name before. Avraham Faust. Egyptologist Jan Assmann. Nice name. Egyptologist Jan Assmann suggests that the Exodus narrative combines, among other things, the expulsion of the Hyksos, the religious revolution of Akhenaten, the experiences of the Habiru, and the large-scale migrations of the Sea Peoples into a coherent story that is fictional as to its composition, but historical as to some of its components. So you see what they're saying? They're saying that the Exodus narrative was taken from all of these people. The Hyksos, possibly a little of Akhenaten, maybe some Habiru, and this came together with the large migrations of the Sea Peoples. So you can see how they're using the mythological basis as a foundation for the story itself, as opposed to being necessarily historical from the standpoint of being true in their definition, because they're looking for historical evidence in this place where none exists. Therefore, the story doesn't exist. The consensus among modern scholars is that the Torah does not give an accurate account of the origins of the Israelites. There's no indications that the Israelites ever lived in ancient Egypt, and the Sinai Peninsula shows almost no signs of any occupation for the entire 2nd millennium BC. Even Kadesh Barnea, where the Israelites were said to have spent 38 years, was uninhabited prior to the early 12th century BCE. In contrast to the absence of evidence for the Egyptian captivity and wilderness wanderings, there are ample signs of Israel's evolution within Canaan from native Canaanite roots. Where a few scholars continue to discuss the historicity, or at least plausibility, of the Exodus story, the majority of archaeologists have abandoned it. In the phrase used by archaeologist William Dever as a fruitless pursuit. The majority of archaeologists have abandoned it. In the phrase used by archaeologist William Dever as a fruitless pursuit. The biblical narrative contains some details which are authentically Egyptian. But such details are scant, and the story frequently does not reflect Egypt of the late Bronze Age, or even Egypt at all. It is unlikely, for example, that a mother would place a baby in the reeds of the Nile, where it would be in danger from crocodiles. Such elements of the narrative can be fitted into the 2nd millennium, could only belong to the first, consistent with a 1st millennium BCE writer trying to set an old story in Egypt. And this would be true about the script of the Bible as well. As languages change, so do the meanings of words change, especially with the Torah, which was an oral version of these stories that later became written. And most writing at this time was a consequence of trade, or one speaking people having a communication with a people who spoke a different language, by people who weren't the same people, by people who did not speak the same language. That's why these are called translations. Continuing, according to Exodus 12, the Israelites numbered about 600,000 men on foot besides women and children, plus a mixed multitude and livestock. Numbers gives a more precise number of 603,550 men aged 20 and up. It is difficult to reconcile the idea of 600,000 Israelite fighting men with the formation that the Israelites were afraid of the Philistines and Egyptians. The 600,000 plus wives and children, the elderly, and the mixed multitude of non-Israelites would have numbered some 2 to 2.5 million. Marching 10 abreast without accounting for livestock, they would have formed a column about 144 miles long. At the tradition of time setting for this putative event, Egypt's population would have been estimated to be in the range of 3 to 4.5 million. No evidence has been found that Egypt ever suffered the demographic and economic catastrophe such a loss of population would represent, nor that the Sinai Desert ever hosted or could have hosted these millions of people and their herds. Some have rationalized these numbers in smaller figures, for example, reading the Hebrew as 600 families rather than 600,000 men. But all such solutions have their own set of problems, end quote. The biggest problem with this is the sheer growth of the Israelite population from the generations of Jacob to the Exodus. How could this number have grown to over 600,000 fighting men, just the men, who were supposedly Israelites? Is it plausible for 12 men to go to 600,000 men in such a short amount of time? Hey, you gotta do a lot of fucking to put them kind of numbers out. Them Wilt Chamberlain numbers. Most archaeologists and Egyptologists agree the Exodus is not a verifiable event due to the lack of evidence found in Egypt. They all see it as mythological with no substantial historical value. Well, the same could be said about other sites as well they claim to be the true locations of the Old Testament. The point here isn't to argue the historicity of the Exodus necessarily, but rather show you how and why these places are not what they claim them to be, and their methods for determining these locations are not only fraudulent, but downright stupid. Most of these so-called biblical locations point to a well-orchestrated Christian hoax. It seems as though Christians were looking to reappropriate and relocate biblical locations for themselves. Take Helena of Constantinople, for example. She was Constantine's mother, and of course, Constantine was the first Roman emperor to become a Christian and initiate the widespread of Christian propaganda throughout Rome, with the Council of Nicaea and the Creed of Constantinople, as the narrative goes. It was his mother, Saint Helena, who supposedly discovered the true cross, which is allegedly the cross Christ was crucified upon. There are too many holes in that story to just name one, but the biggest hole in the story is the fact that Jerusalem had long been destroyed and abandoned for over 300 years between the crucifixion and Constantine. This location, for all intents and purposes, was created by newly Hellenized Christians to give Roman Christians a holy land, rather than Jews or Muslims who had yet to be invented yet in that part of the world. The Muslims weren't a thing until 300 years later, and the Khazar Jews didn't convert to Judaism until 400 years later. These sites denote the beginning of Christianity in Rome. They literally just chose a spot and called it Jerusalem, with no evidence to solidify that claim. But they didn't need any. They were making it all up anyway. What did early classical Christians know about the Old Testament? They didn't even know about Christianity, and the New Testament wasn't even a thing at the time. So they had the same creative license as George Lucas. To add even more ridiculousness to the story, Constantine's mama ordered the construction of the St. Catherine Monastery at the foot of Mount Sinai. Allegedly, they enclosed the burning bush in a building called St. Helen's Chapel. That's right, they enclosed the burning bush, allegedly, in St. Helen's Chapel. This was the location they chose for Mount Sinai. Let's keep this in mind. This location was chosen over 1,000 years after the Exodus. And there's no evidence that these Romans had ever known any of these biblical locations. They weren't even named until the early Christian era. Remember, Rome had supposedly been in Egypt since the days of Cleopatra and Mark Antony. And ironically, Harry Hubbard says that he has found relics in Illinois with depictions of Cleopatra and Mark Antony. But no Roman could read hieroglyphics until after 1820, much less Phoenician, Canaanite, or Assyrian. All of these languages weren't translated by Europeans until after the 19th and 20th centuries. They have never provided any tangible evidence for these locations other than their supreme, unquestioned church authority. Does anyone really think that this is the actual site of Mount Sinai? Especially after knowing how this location came about. Now, these biblical archaeologists are forced to put a square peg into a round hole. Have you seen the proposed Exodus routes? Some archaeologists have tried to recreate the route from the desert and through the wilderness based upon the proposed locations of the Exodus events. Let's just say, not only are these proposals preposterous, there's also no evidence to suggest that these places have ever been as such. No documentation of Hebrew habitation, no script, no artifacts, only the boxed-in theories of the charlatan biblical hierarchy. Another huge problem for them is the fact that this area doesn't topographically, zoologically, or geologically match the descriptions given of Egypt in the Bible. With all this being said, let's take a look at America to see the most biblically plausible or suitable location for the events of the Exodus. based upon previously established locations. At the top would be the Cedar of Lebanon, representing the Pacific Northwest from Northern California to as far north as British Columbia, with other trees like the bristlecone pine indicating the edge of the desert. The Red Sea being the extension or dried northern portion of the Gulf of California, the same area the Red Sea is located on the older maps of the island of California. The most suitable location of the Exodus is within the Mojave or Colorado and possibly the Sonoran and Great Basin deserts of the southwest United States and northwest Mexico. This area far more accurately parallels the descriptions given in the Old Testament. The most important landmark pertaining to the Exodus is the Red Sea. The problem for most biblical historians as it relates to the Red Sea is that the sea never plays a role again in the narrative throughout all the histories of the Old Testament. When the sea is mentioned in the later histories of the Old Testament, it is a reminder of the Exodus past event, not playing a role in the concurrent story. Charlatans often conflate the Egyptian Sea mentioned in Isaiah 11 with the Red Sea, but that assertion would literally kill their geographic templates for the Nile or the Euphrates. Of the over 24 purported mentions of the Red Sea, the only other time it is mentioned contemporaneously with the events of the text is during the time of Solomon and Hiram during the construction of the temple. 1 Kings 9:26 states Solomon had a navy, a fleet of ships in Ezion-Geber, which is beside Elath on the shore of the Red Sea. The other later mention in Jeremiah 49 mentioned the Red Sea as to where cries can be heard. The other mentions are cause for remembrance. But for the most part, the sea is no longer mentioned as part of the biblical storyline. Why is that? Being so centrally located within the alleged biblical landscape, it is hard to believe that the Red Sea never played a role in the later days after the fall of Israel. Wars of the Assyrians, Babylonians, Persians, the Greek, and Rome, none of these nations traveled that sea again during the rest of the entire biblical narrative. It went from the most important sea to never being used again. It's almost like the Red Sea disappeared. What happened to the Red Sea? There are multiple examples in the later books of Joshua and Psalms that suggest the sea had dried up. Whatever the story may be concerning the Red Sea in the later days, it never appears again as part of the concurrent story. Its last mention within the story is only to establish a location for Solomon's army at Ezion-Geber, which is located on the Red Sea by Edom. This mention is notable because if we use the modern alleged location of Ezion-Geber at the Gulf of Aqaba, the navigational route from Tyre or Lebanon to Ezion-Geber would have been around the entire continent of Africa. So for Hiram of Tyre to reach Ezion-Geber, he would have to circumnavigate the entire continent. Not impossible, but an absurd course nonetheless. This was never mentioned as a shipping route in the Old Testament, and no other mentions of the Red Sea are concurrent with later storylines. This brings us to the only other evidence from the archaeological world concerning the existence of Ezion-Geber. This is important because there hasn't been any evidence found in the place on the Gulf of Aqaba said to be Ezion-Geber, linking it to that location. The Pariyaba stone is the only archaeological evidence discovered substantiating the existence of Ezion-Geber, and it was found in Brazil. The inscription says the men were Sidonian Canaanites from the land of the mercantile king. They sacrificed a child to the celestial gods and goddesses in the 19th year of Hiram, king of Tyre. They were on a voyage for 2 years around the land of Ham, which is supposedly Africa. They were stranded and had lost communication with the other ships on their voyage. If they were circumnavigating Africa, how did they end up in Brazil? Once again, this isn't impossible. I guess they could have gotten blown across the entire ocean. But wouldn't it make more sense that they were blown off course circumnavigating South America, especially if they had ended up in Brazil? Some of the earliest maps of America show the area where Panama is today being submerged underwater. In my estimation, Ezion Gibber is most likely located near the mouth of today's Colorado River on the edge of Edom, which literally means colored red, aka Colorado, which is a literal synonym of the word Edom. When most people think of Colorado, they think of the Rockies, but the etymology of Colorado lends itself more to the Four Corners region in the southwest portion of the state. The red cliffs and canyons of Colorado, Arizona, Nevada, Utah, and New Mexico are geological indicators of the land of Edom, as mentioned in the Old Testament. We know this simply by grouping the natural features of the land. It would have to be in the vicinity of the Red Sea, but also close to other natural features we have already mentioned, like the desert fir tree or even the bristlecone pine. Edom was the land originally inhabited by Seir the Horite. Many historians say the word Horite indicates one of a few things. It could mean cave dweller, cliff dweller, a non-human of some sort, or simply the white race. Timnah and Alohibama, who were wives or concubines of Eliphaz, son of Esau. And Timnah was the mother of Amalek, the progenitor of the Amalekites. They are described by rabbinical scholars by their etymology, meaning people who drink blood. These ancient blood-sucking rituals are still being practiced in Edom even unto this day, from Lake Havasu, Arizona to Colorado Springs. This ancient demonic practice is said to have been passed down through the generations by a priesthood of old world shaman, who are said to have lived in this area as natives since the times of antiquity, and who are speculated to be the bloodline descendants of the fallen. Also, with the presence of massive underground cave systems and cliff dwellings in the area, all of these aspects make this area an even more suitable location for ancient Edom. Add in the sheer amount of paranormal activity and deep underground military bases, this area is a magnet for the practice of witchcraft and black magic. Have you ever heard of Dragonfest, or the Witches' Ball, or the several dozen other festivals of necromancy and witchcraft? These people not only used caves for their rituals, they would use mountains as well to make their sacrifices, just like the high places referred to in the Tanakh. The people who practice this now know that this was a practice in America long before Eurasians arrived. These ancient cult rituals weren't brought by Eurasians, they were taught to Eurasians, many of whom are descendants of Edom, especially those of crypto-Jewish ancestry. A detail about the Exodus that most people find mythological or just simply do not believe is the presence of giants. During the Exodus, there are mentioned at least 3 nations of giants, also known as Rephaim, who were the descendants of the Nephilim, aka the fallen angels from the book of Genesis. Deuteronomy chapter 2 relates that the Amim dwelt in Moab during past times. They were a great and many people, as tall as the Anakims, who were also accounted as giants. Also accounted in the land of giants were the Zamzumims. Another giant mentioned in Deuteronomy chapter 3 is the Amorite king Og of Bashan, described as the remnant of giants. According to Deuteronomy, there are nations of giants who used to inhabit the land, so let's take a trip into the realm of mythology and mystery. Now, if you were to ask any scholastic charlatan about the existence of giants, they'll scoff and tell you they never existed. That every account of a giant human-sized skeleton found anywhere is a hoax. The subject of ancient giants was a well-known secret in America over 100 years ago. At the turn of the century, giants were being found everywhere. So for the purposes of research, let's take a look at some of these supposed hoaxes. America isn't the only place where giants have been found. There have been giants found on other continents. The point here is to show that there were races of giants living in America, more particularly the Southwest United States. And also to show you that in these areas have been excavated the greatest number of giants found anywhere in the world. And there are also giants that have been found all over the United States, including in the Ohio region, the Wisconsin region, the Michigan region, the Florida region, even in Georgia and West Virginia, and even in Pennsylvania. So when we look at these stories today, we all take them as hoaxes. Quote from 1902, archaeologists send expedition to explore graveyards in New Mexico where bodies were unearthed. Owing to the discovery of the remains of a race of giants in Guadalupe, New Mexico, antiquarians and archaeologists are preparing an expedition further to explore that region. This determination is based on the excitement that exists among people of a scope of the country near Mesa Rico, about 200 miles southeast of Las Vegas, where an old burial ground has been discovered that has yielded skeletons of enormous size. The first part of this paragraph is interesting because they're explaining how they've already found the remains of a race of giants in Guadalupe, New Mexico, and that archaeologists are preparing to further explore that region. This is already a bygone conclusion. So since they found giants in that area, they're excited about what else could be found in that area, and that's in Guadalupe, New Mexico. Luciana Quintana, on whose ranch the ancient burial plot was located, discovered two stones that bore curious inscriptions. And beneath those stones were found in shallow excavations the bone of a frame that could not have been less than 12 feet in length. The men who opened the grave say the forearm was 4 feet long, and that in a well-preserved jaw, the lower teeth ranged from the size of a hickory nut to that of the largest walnut in size. The chest of the being is reported as having a circumference of 7 feet. That's a wide body. Quintana, who has uncovered many other burial places, expresses the opinion that perhaps thousands of skeletons of a race of giants long extinct will be found. This supposition is based on the traditions handed down from the early Spanish invasion that have detailed knowledge of the existence of a race of giants that inhabited the plains of what is now eastern New Mexico. Indian legends and carvings also in the same section indicate the existence of such a race, end quote. And this was published in the New York Times in 1902. I know many people think the New York Times is a legitimate newspaper. They'll say if it's not published in the New York Times, I don't believe it. Well, here it is, published in the New York Times. Quote, race of primeval giants. New York, Tuesday. Quote, recent excavations made under the supervision of the faculty of Stanford University, California, indicate that the entire peninsula south of San Francisco was once inhabited by a race of giants. Professor Harold Heath of the zoological department of the university, according to a statement just given out by the faculty, has unearthed about 2 miles distant from the university several skeletons of men who were of great height and build. The prehistoric village, covering near 2 acres in the area, was the scene of Professor Heath's investigations. Stone hammers, bone owls, and ornaments found by his party indicate that the owners had attained considerable advancement in artisanship and civilization, end quote. So this is from the faculty at Stanford University. Uncovered a race of giants 2 miles south of the university. Ancient giants used to inhabit San Francisco.
He said Bonds drilled a ball, just annihilated it, but right to the second baseman who turned it into a double play the first time he faced him. Bonds swings, and there it goes. It's headed for McCovey Cove. It is gone, a home run.
Ancient giants used to inhabit San Francisco.
A shot that took 2 seconds to get out of here, over the wall, over the arcade, over everything. 2-1 Giants.
Quote, Days of the Giants, a skeleton relic of ideal prehistoric men. Quote, a huge skeleton of a man bearing indications of a prehistoric race have been discovered at Fort Garland, Colorado. The bones were in a remarkable state of preservation and were evidently those of the period when the mammoth roamed the mountains of the Sangre de Cristo and Sierra Blanca. The skull, bones of one arm, both legs, and the spinal cord were intact. Measurements showed the man to be 7 feet 2 inches. The lower jawbone is sufficiently large to cover entirely the jaw of an average man today. So they're saying they discovered a giant of a man who's 7 feet 2 inches. And we don't really look at people who are 7 feet 2 inches as another race of people today. I mean, that's probably 10% of the NBA. Most people look at Shaquille O'Neal as a human. Most people look at Victor Wembanyama as a human. Are these giants or larger than average humans? Quote, The World, October 6th, 1895. Biggest giant ever known, 9 feet high, and probably a prehistoric California Indian. Measurement well authenticated. Other big men and women of fact and fable who are famous types of gigantism. Quote, the corpse of the biggest man that ever lived has been dug up near San Diego, California. At all events, there's no satisfactory record in ancient or modern history of any human being nearly so tall. The mummy, for in such conditions the remains were found, is that of a person who must have been about 9 feet high in life. This makes allowance for the shrinkage, which may be pretty closely calculated. As to the accuracy in the estimate, there can be no question, as the cadaver has been carefully inspected and measured by Professor Thomas Wilson, curator of the Department of Prehistoric Anthropology in the Smithsonian Institution, and by other scientists. Oh, so the Smithsonian has actually authenticated the credibility of this giant. But according to the Smithsonian, there are no giants. Imagine all of the things that are being hidden by the Smithsonian. If you could go to the vault of the Smithsonian, you would probably find giants and minotaurs and dwarves and fairies and hybrids of all types. Why hasn't the Smithsonian ever spoken about the giants? We know they've never even heard of G.E. Kincaid, the man who supposedly found the Egyptian city in the Grand Canyon. They've never heard of him. And just like all of these artifacts that do not fit into their historical narrative, when they're given to the Smithsonian, they disappear. What happened to it? What happened to all the giants that were given to the Smithsonian? There are several accounts of people finding giants and having the giants sent to the Smithsonian, never to be heard from again. So we know we have races of giants between California and New Mexico, and of course other areas. But the point here is to show that this region in the Southwest has the highest concentration of giants found and excavated anywhere in the world. Because in other areas, when giants are being excavated, in most cases, they're single giants. Now, I do know of some examples, especially in the eastern United States and Ohio and Pennsylvania country, where graveyards of supposed giants were discovered. And when we're saying giants, they're describing these burials averaging 7 feet tall, some as tall as 8 feet. So we're not talking about 30-foot men or 40-foot men. We're talking about, the size of an NBA center. It's also important to pay attention to the measurements as well, where these giants may be a lot wider, a lot bigger, a lot thicker. They may have a protruded brow. However, in the Southwest United States, where the highest concentration of giant burials have been found, these burial sites may have hundreds of giants that are averaging over 9 feet in height. This picture here is probably one of the more famous pictures of giants. We can see the man standing beside the giant that was found, supposedly a California Indian, or supposedly a giant of many giants found in that area in California. So if you've ever done any research on giants, at some point you have probably seen this picture. Quote, giant skeletons found on coast, Los Angeles, California. William Derbyshire and Jack Stoneberger of Chicago and Robert Derbyshire of Santa Monica contractors have unearthed the skeleton of a giant prehistoric man at Santa Monica Beach. The skeleton was over 9 feet in height. Hard work uncovered 13 more similar skeletons. 3 perfect specimens were brought to Santa Monica for exhibition, and scientists who have examined them say they undoubtedly are hundreds of years old. The skulls have formation of an Indian head, with high cheekbones and other pronounced characteristics. In every case, the teeth are practically intact. Santa Monica, giants found 9 feet tall. 1 giant found, 13 others found. Wouldn't you know it, another article from the San Diego Union, trace of giants found in desert. Quote, a retired doctor has discovered relics of an ancient civilization whose men were 8 or 9 feet tall in the Colorado desert near the Arizona, Nevada, California line. And associates said today, Howard E. Hill of Los Angeles, speaking before the Transportation Club, disclosed that several well-preserved mummies were taken yesterday from the caverns in an area roughly 180 miles squared, extending through much of southern Nevada from Death Valley, California, across the Colorado River into Arizona. The rest of this article is too hard to read. They were discovered and were clothed in garments of some animal that they do not know exactly what it is, as an animal unknown today. But mainly the point here is being that the remnants of a civilization where mummies were found that were 8 to 9 feet tall on the Arizona, Nevada, California line. Quote, this was indeed a giant. Yesterday, a fragment of a human skeleton was brought to Carson, Nevada from Pine Grove near Genoa. The original skeleton must have been fully 25 feet long. The bone was a portion of the leg below the knee. At the point where it joined the knee was 8 inches across, or 5 times the usual size. The fragment was about 2 feet long, splendidly preserved, and weighed about 20 pounds. All the local physicians agree that it is unquestionably a portion of the skeleton of the largest human remains yet discovered. Parties are going to Pine Grove to search for the rest of the skeleton. So they found a bone, and they're like, well, if this is the bone I think it is, then this guy is really tall. Usually, if I want something to be seen as more credible, I need to come with a fully intact skeleton, or at least a more fully intact skeleton. It's like the thing they do with the dinosaurs, where they find a pinky bone and they'll be like, yes, this pinky bone came off a T-Rex. Like, nigga, you have never found a fully intact T-Rex. You've never just seen a T-Rex buried in the ground with all of its bones intact. This could have very well been the remnant of a giant, but finding one bone isn't as convincing as finding an intact skeleton. Quote from the Smithsonian, they found giants in China, nigga. The Smithsonian, hey, they finally came clean. After all these years, we've been thinking the Smithsonian's hiding shit. Turns out we just haven't been reading. Graveyard of giants found in China. Yes. Now this is a discovery, Smithsonian. It's about damn time. Many of these 5,000-year-old skeletons measured 5'9" or longer, making the Neolithic humans exceptionally tall for that period. Hold on. Graveyard of giants found in China. Many of the 5,000-year-old skeletons measured 5'9" or longer. All right, Smithsonian. I don't even want to read the article. I guess 5'9" is a giant in China. We know the Chinese are notoriously short, so I guess 5'9" would be considered a giant in China. All right. Nothing to see here. Nothing to see. The next place we want to highlight is Elim, the place during the Exodus where was located 12 fountains of water and 70 palm trees. A problem for the biblical archaeologist who claims that this location is on the Sinai Peninsula in modern-day Egypt is the fact that there is no evidence of this place anywhere in the vicinity. The biggest oasis in Egypt is to the west and nowhere near the Red Sea or the Exodus route. When we compare this area to the region around the Mojave Desert, there is really no comparison. There are more natural springs of several different types in just this area than the entire country of Egypt. In fact, San Bernardino, California has more springs alone than all of Egypt. Include the surrounding areas like San Diego, Riverside, Palm Springs, Palo Verde, Crystal Spring, Borrego Springs, and the literal hundreds to thousands of springs located in and around the Mojave Great Basin and Colorado deserts. And we have yet to mention the numerous springs in Nevada and Arizona. Geologists say that there are over 4,000 natural springs in the state of Arizona alone. I approximate that the biblical location of Elim is somewhere near the vicinity of the Palm Desert, the Coachella Valley, Borrego Springs, or San Bernardino, California. This area seems the most probable location. These springs would be hugging the border of the Red Sea, as described in the Exodus. And if we look at the location of the Red Sea on the older maps of the island of California, this is a perfect location. This area is home to several different types of springs, from mineral springs to thermal springs, to freshwater springs, carbonated springs, even artesian wells. Not just in the San Bernardino area, even in Los Angeles, there are several natural springs. This is a random question, but I always wondered why they called the medical center in Los Angeles Cedars-Sinai. The medical center was literally named after the cedars of Lebanon, but it's located in California. Now, of course, the center was founded by a crypto-Jewish businessman in 1902. And in 1918, other crypto-Jews opened Mount Sinai Hospital, and in 1961, they merged together into Cedars-Sinai. I just think the naming of this hospital is intriguing, especially considering what we know about the Exodus. In my opinion, I think this medical center was named Cedars-Sinai for a more intentional and clandestine reason. Knowing what we know now, we can see that the hospital is somewhere in the region of the Cedars of Lebanon and Mount Sinai. Many of these places and names have hidden meanings. Think about the location of all the springs in the Palm Desert and the Mojave Desert. And just like Cedars-Sinai, many of these springs are in the vicinity of Joshua Tree National Park. But why is it called Joshua Tree? Apparently, it was those damn Mormons again. You know how they do, always looking to muddy the biblical waters, pun intended, to find any little nugget of evidence that will substantiate the Book of Mormon. So as the narrative goes, in the mid to late 1850s, a group of Mormons traveling out west named the trees in this area Joshua trees after Joshua of the Old Testament. However, it's important to note that this story can't be substantiated by anyone, including the National Park Service or Joshua Tree historians. So although there's been speculation that the Mormons named Joshua Tree, it's only speculation, and there's no actual connection between Mormons and the naming of Joshua Tree. The name is still, unto this day, surrounded in mythology. Given what we know today about the Exodus and this area in California being more topographically suited, one can clearly see how Joshua had stepped foot somewhere in the vicinity of Joshua Tree National Park. Accompanying the Joshua Tree within the park is a most unusual granite rock formation, almost resembling ancient walls. Could these have been the walls of Jericho? According to biblical geography, Jericho should actually be located much further from this region, to the north and to the east. So this location doesn't exactly fit into the biblical geographic template, but it is an interesting characteristic nonetheless. Another interesting characteristic in Joshua Tree National Park and the rock formations is the appearance of this huge megaphone on top of one of the formations. No one has claimed responsibility for putting it there, and most historians agree that this megaphone has been here far longer than most people have been settling in the California region. Just imagine an army of Israelites using shofars made from the horns of bighorn sheep and blowing the shofar and using cymatics to melt the walls of Jericho. The initial point is that all of these locations are not named by mistake. There are always clues hidden inside the etymology. So the long-held rumor that the Mormons actually named Joshua Tree Park can't be substantiated by any historian of the subject. But when you inject Mormons into the equation, the math always gets a little funny. Because we have seen throughout this series that Mormons and their biblically or Book of Mormon related discoveries are always taken to be a fraud or a hoax. And this is what the charlatan usually does when a discovery is made in the American Southwest or anywhere on the American continent that contradicts their historical narrative or their rigid transatlantic contact theories. According to them, any single shred of evidence pointing to an ancient Hebrew or Egyptian or Assyrian habitation anywhere in America is a hoax. And the number one culprit is always a Mormon, even if the artifact in question wasn't discovered by a Mormon. Take the Los Lunas Decalogue Stone of New Mexico, for example. This stone wasn't found or discovered by any Mormons, but Mormons have been blamed for the fabrication of this particular stone. They just inject the Mormon narrative, and all of a sudden, the object or artifact loses credibility. Quote, skeleton found showing giants roamed Sierras. Sacramento, October 28th, quote, the recent discovery of a skeleton near MacArthur, Shasta County, believed to be that of a prehistoric giant who stumbled and was caught by a lava flow from Mount Lassen, has again given rise to the question, was California inhabited by human beings millions of years ago? The answer of scientists to this question, as far as preliminary investigations go, is yes. The Great Valley of California geologists have found apparently existed much as at the present time since man's earliest known appearance on Earth. Article goes on to say how geologists say that much of the flora and fauna seem to have retained their essential elements for hundreds of thousands of years, in a sense where California could have some of the oldest flora and fauna in the world. Continuing, the Shasta County skeleton was discovered about 12 feet under lava rock, being excavated by a steam shovel. The skull was well preserved, as well as several of the larger bones. It is believed that the man was taken over by the great lava flow that once spread over Modoc County and into Oregon and Idaho. Although this is far north of the Great Central Valley, geological data has shown that the area has offered a suitable habitat for man since the earliest Pleistocene age. Since this is true, said a report of Schneck and Dawson, and since ethnologists are convinced that California has been occupied by man from remote times, it seems possible that the alluvial fill in the vicinity of the area may yet reveal archaeological evidence of these early inhabitants, end quote. So this is another skeleton found in the Sierras, near Mount Shasta. Charlatan's Web quote, the Los Lunas Decalogue Stone is a hoax. They just go ahead and tell you. It's a hoax associated with a large boulder on the side of Hidden Mountain near Los Lunas, New Mexico, about 35 miles south of Albuquerque. That area is a hotspot of conspiratorial ancient findings and discoveries. 35 miles south of Albuquerque that bears a 9-line inscription carved into a flat panel. The stone is also known as the Los Lunas Mystery Stone or Commandment Rock. The stone has gained notoriety in that some claim the inscription is pre-Columbian and therefore proof of early Shemitic contact with the Americas. Standard archaeological evidence contradicts this, however. There you go. Hit you with the double caveat. It's a hoax, and archaeological evidence contradicts this. Of course it does. Of course it does. The first recorded mention of the stone is in 1933 when Professor Frank Hibben, an archaeologist from the University of New Mexico, saw it. According to a 1996 interview, Hibben was convinced the inscription is ancient and thus authentic. He reported that he first saw the text in 1933. At the time, it was covered with lichen and patination and was hardly visible. He claimed he was taken to the site by a guide who claimed he had seen it as a boy back in the 1880s. However, Hidden's testimony is tainted by charges that in at least 2 separate incidents, he fabricated some or all of his archaeological data to support his pre-Clovis migration theory. Oh, so the guy who found it has a tainted past. The reported 1880s date of the discovery is important to those who believe that the stone is pre-Columbian. However, the Paleo-Hebrew script, which is closely related to the Phoenician script, was known by scholars by at least 1870, thus not precluding the possibility of a modern hoax. Oh! So the script used on the stone, modern scholars knew what they were doing by 1870. So if he found it in the 1880s, there was plenty enough time for a modern scholar to go in and fabricate a hoax and then just have a guy find it. That's why I say it's always important to pay attention to the chronological detail. I have no opinion on the authenticity of this stone. I can't tell if it's real or fake. But it's an interesting fake nonetheless, if it is fake. If it's authentic, what are we talking about? America is Egypt. Because of the stone's weight over 80 tons, it was never moved to a museum or a laboratory for study and safekeeping. Many visitors have cleaned the stone inscriptions over the years, likely destroying any possibility for scientific analysis of the inscription's patina. Nevertheless, comparing it to a modern inscription nearby, geologist George E. Morehouse, a colleague of Barry Fell estimated that the inscription could be between 500 and 2,000 years old, and explaining its freshness and lack of patina as being due to frequent scrubbing to make it more visible. In April 06, the first line of the unprotected inscription was obliterated by vandals. I wonder who actually vandalized this stone and what was their reasoning behind the vandalization. Did somebody just want to taint the legitimacy of the rock? Why vandalize it? Just wonder why. Visitors to the site are required to purchase a $35 recreational access permit from the New Mexico State Land Office. They gonna get that money. It's an amusement park. Just like Egypt, just an amusement park. They created, took less time than the pyramids, obviously. Archaeolinguist Cyrus Gordon has proposed that the Los Lunas Decalogue stone is a Samaritan mezuzah. The familiar Jewish mezuzah is a tiny scroll placed in a small container mounted by the entrance to a house. The ancient Samaritan mezuzah, on the other hand, was commonly a large slab placed by the gateway to a property or synagogue, and bearing an abridged version of the Decalogue. On historical and epigraphic grounds, Gordon regards the Byzantine period as the most likely for the inscription. The Samaritan alphabet is a direct descendant of the Paleo-Hebrew alphabet. One argument against the stone's antiquity is its apparent use of modern Hebrew, or otherwise atypical punctuation. Though amateur apographer Barry Fell argued that the punctuation is consistent with antiquity. He's an amateur apographer, by the way. Other researchers dismissed the inscription based on the numerous stylistic and grammatical errors that appear in the inscription. You see what they do? They bust it for grammar all the time. Well, grammatically it's wrong. As if they had the guide to ancient syntax. I've busted the Associated Press and the New York Times on grammar. Does that mean when somebody pulls the newspaper article 1,000 years from now, it's a fake story? These guys were professors of ancient grammar. Languages the world has barely known for the last 100 years. All of a sudden, these people are experts. Other researchers dismissed the inscription based on the numerous stylistics and grammatical errors that appear in the inscription. And again, I'm not caping for the legitimacy of this rock. I have no opinion on its authenticity. My opinions mostly stem around these asshole archaeologists who claim they know everything about ancient language. According to archaeologist Ken Fetter, the stone is almost certainly a fake. He points out that the flat face of the stone shows a very sharp, crisp inscription. His main concern, however, is the lack of any archaeological context. There's no context for it. There's no context. How did it get here? Who knew how to speak this language? He argues that to get to the location of the stone would have required whoever inscribed it to have stopped along the way, encamped, eaten food, broken things, disposed of trash, performed rituals, and so on. And those actions should have left a trail of physical archaeological evidence across the greater American Southwest, discovery of which would undeniably prove the existence of foreigners in New Mexico in antiquity with a demonstrably ancient Hebrew material culture, and states that there are no pre-Columbian ancient Hebrew settlements, no settlements containing the everyday detritus of a band of ancient Hebrews, nothing that even a cursory knowledge of how the archaeological record forms would demand there would be. From an archaeological standpoint, that's plainly impossible. End quote, Kenneth Feder. There's no context for it. How did they get here? There's no Hebrews here. There's no Egyptians. There's none of that old world fuckery. This is America, boy. The land of the savages. The land of the savages without culture. British archaeologist Keith Fitzpatrick Matthews has concluded that, viewed dispassionately, the Los Lunas inscription is a clear but well-constructed forgery for its day. Despite the claims of high antiquity, there are features of the text, such as mixing of letter forms between two separate alphabets, that are much more likely to derive from the work of a modern forger than from an ancient Hebrew or Samaritan scribe. Other speculative origin myths include the idea that members of a passing U.S. Army battalion made up of primarily Mormon soldiers. Mormon soldiers. Those damn Mormons. I told you. Those damn Mormons. At it again. We can't prove that it was fabricated, but it was probably the Mormons. End quote, Charlatan's Web. This article is pretty blurry, so I can't read the words, but I can make out the title. Arizona man won't sell skeleton of his prehistoric giant. The reason why this article is important is because this man lived near Prescott, Arizona. And of course, Prescott, Arizona, that whole area around Prescott, Arizona, several giant burials have been found. One of those being Sycamore Creek. Ancient burying ground uncovered. Skeletons found indicate that race of giants once lived on the banks of Sycamore Creek. Sycamore Creek not being far from Prescott, Arizona, where all other giants were found. Also, we find that a race of giants lived near Sycamore Creek, Arizona. Quote, a prehistoric graveyard on Sycamore Creek, where the grade of the Verde Railroad passes through, has been uncovered by a crew of laborers under the direction of conductor C.W. Corbin in performing certain excavations to improve the roadway. Let me stop here and say this. The railroad industry is hiding a ton of secrets. In many cases, they were the first people to prospect these undiscovered areas. We can also say the people who built the roads. These groups were the first to excavate these areas. And in several cases on record, they've come across giants. There has thus been revealed a very interesting situation that prevailed at some time or another in the physical makeup of a race, as is reflected in the massive remains that have been recovered and which are indisputable of a giant type of humanity that is bewildering to those of this generation. The skull of a human is in possession of Mr. Corbin, together with a portion of the frame that would indicate one who in life must have attained the height of at least 8 feet. Giant remains also found in Kern County, California, which these people say the giant was 12 feet tall. These are not all the giants found in the world. This area just happens to be the place in the world with the highest concentration of giants. As far as the location of Mount Sinai goes, it's much harder to pinpoint. Presumably, it is a desert mountain somewhere in the vicinity of the former Red Sea, but also not far from the 12 fountains and 70 palms of Elim. As far as the bitter waters of Marah, I would put near the Mexicali area, in an area with brackish water, resembling the presumed salty or bitter waters of Marah mentioned in Exodus chapter 15 as the location they arrived before Elim. A lake like Laguna Salada fits this description pretty well in terms of its characteristics. Even the etymology of its name fits almost perfectly, salty lagoon, and the wood used to filter the salt or bitterness out of the water in the book of Exodus could have very well been a mangrove branch. Mangrove trees are known to desalinate water by over 90%, and it just so happens that there are mangroves all over this region, especially along the coast of the Gulf of California. According to estimates of the biblical itinerary, there should have been between 20 and 25 days travel between Elim and Mount Sinai. The question would be, how many miles per day could 2 million people walk? I would say a safe estimate would be somewhere between 8 and 15 miles a day. Overall, that would be between 150 and 225 miles. This would also account for Sabbath rest days. With all this being said, Mount Sinai should be within a 225-mile radius in the direction of nearby adjacent deserts from the location of Elim. Putting Elim somewhere in the Palm Springs, Palm Desert, or San Bernardino area, an area with more springs in just that location than the entirety of Egypt, Mount Sinai should be within a radius of 225 miles in the direction of nearby adjacent deserts, meaning that Mount Sinai most likely is in or around the Mojave Desert. Although I'm not exactly sure which mountain it could be, I am certain it is in this area. And I am even more certain that not only is America Egypt, America is the ancient Holy Land.